So what we're planning on doing today is talk about what positionality means, reflexivity as well, because it's something that it's in our lives, not just as researchers, but as practitioners of academia, but also practitioners in other things that we've done, or maybe we do in our life. Some of us manage people as well. So we're going to talk about some of our experiences. Specifically, Bianca will cover the research-focused side of positionality and reflexivity. I'll talk more about the experience as a lecturer and also as a former practitioner, so outside academia, because we think there's some parallels and some things that we can learn from that. And then we'll talk about academic activism, because through positionality and through reflexivity, we think that we can do more than just research our topics in isolation and try to promote change through that, social change, social justice, not only in our students, but in the topics that we choose to investigate and to have some sort of an impact, right, in society and workplaces and so on. And then a discussion at the end. So we'll try to sort of follow that. And Bianca will cover the more theoretical background and then share her insights as a researcher, and then move on to the rest of it. But
right, okay, so yeah, positionality, what does that actually mean? So let's define it. So as it says here, it describes an individual's worldview and the position they have chosen to adopt in relation to a specific research task. So the idea behind this really is that, you know, we all come with a particular worldview. So, and that worldview colored by all these different factors that you can see here are listed there. So may it be, you know, religion, gender, sexuality, your geographical location, ethnicity, social class, your personal life history is also very important. So, and these factors and your positionality really are relevant for the entire research process, from the point where you actually, you know, choose to select a certain research topic, develop a certain research interest, you know, all the way to the approach maybe you take to disseminating your findings. So really all the way through. So it requires the researcher to think about his, her position in relation to the participant, the research, context of the research, and as I said, the whole research process. What is very important here is that positionality is never fixed. So it's always situation and context dependent. And that means it changes with every single research project as well. And that's something we'll give you examples of this as we go along. So what's reflexivity? That's the essential part of a researcher identifying their positionality. So you reflect on who you are in relation to a certain research project that you're developing. So it really requires self-consciousness, self-assessment. You really have to think about, you know, all these different aspects that are already mentioned. But as I said before, always in relation to a certain study. So how, you know, your positionality influences the design, execution, interpretation of the research data. So to use this reflexive approach really also means that rejects the notion that, you know, social research is separate from wider society and the individual researcher's biography. So what does that actually mean for quantitative? I mean, in qualitative search, it's really said that, well, if you don't have a statement of the researcher's positionality, the meaning of the findings really get lost to a considerable extent. So it's always very important to read a paper to people. It helps you to also interpret the truthfulness of the findings if you know more about the background of the person that has conducted the study or the team that has conducted the study. So, but positivism would then obviously deny the relevance of the vision. So, quantitative research has really mostly remained detached from this level of reflexivity and reflective practices. But I'm asking, you know, however, how do quantitative researchers choose their research projects? So on which presumptions is the project based? How do you adopt a certain angle on a topic? I mean, all these different, you know, aspects here, the personal background, how do you select a sample? Which questions do you decide to include in a questionnaire? So it's very, very similar actually, but it's really been neglected until very recently. And there now slowly is an increasing part of reflexivity across all different research approaches. So just in case that you've been sitting here as a quantitative researcher, this is all about quantitative research. It's about all of us. And I also think it's not really about research. It's about our day-to-day lives, our actions in all spheres of our lives, work, private sphere, all word anyway. So reflection. So there's been a big debate around positionality about the usefulness of being an insider or an outsider in a research project. And that's usually used when talking about maybe white Western researchers going to study something in the global South as an outsider and what it actually means. Research on the population that's quite different from their own. So yeah, these sorts of debates. But it also, again, my argument, I think it applies to all different spheres. Also, if you do something within the same country, maybe not only for, for another organization, also within your own organization, maybe you're in different departments. So once again, it's all transferable. But the key debate really here is like to what extent you can actually represent findings accurately. How do you actually, you've got a data set and there's always some subjectivity involved. You present somebody with a set of interviews and different individuals would actually interpret the findings slightly differently because they might come from different angles. So here are the key debate. What are the disadvantages, advantages of somebody as an insider or outsider? And let's explore this a little bit. There also is the space in between. So obvious advantages of being an insider. It's easier to access the culture being studied. You're regarded as one of them, you're one of us. You can maybe ask more meaningful questions because you already have knowledge about the population. You understand the language, colloquial language, certain insiders maybe. So yes, you can produce, as it says here, truthful, authentic description. Maybe more trusted. That secures more honest knowledge. However, there are also disadvantages because you may, unknowingly be biased. You might also be too close to the culture. There might be things, if you've grown up in cultural context, there might be questions that you're taking for granted. You would not have raised these questions. It would not have been a question for you at all. So yeah, you can also get away with very dumb questions if you're not an insider, and maybe also questions that would have been perceived within a particular cultural context as rude, inappropriate. But what does all this mean for analysis and interpretation of data? So you may know Strauss and Corbin, grounded theory. So it's all about inductive, approaches and, generating understanding from the data inductively. And even they, at some stage, admitted, well, research is seldom purely inductive because we all come with sort of a prejudiced mind, we come with assumptions. And so already if you do a literature review on a certain topic before you go out collecting data, you're not a blank sheet anymore. Can you ever be a blank sheet of paper? So I wanted to give you a couple of examples from my research to sort of unpick a little bit more how I personally have positionality reflexivity. And I first came across the demand of having to prepare a positionality statement when I was conducting my PhD. It was a study on social entrepreneurs over 50 in the UK. So people over 50 were setting up their own socially minded organizations. Yeah, I mean, okay, the people I was studying, they were older than me, so that meant something for our research relationships, power relationships, how they treated me. I reflected on that, included it in the PhD, very neat process, fine. Then when I was going out to these countries doing research on maternity protection, it was all a very different experience. So I went to Ghana. Yes, you know, it's good to work with local researchers because it was giving me access, you know, this insider-outsider perspective, you know, lots of advantages of having these schemes, but already there, you know, when speaking to low-income women in the informal economy, there were these clear power relationships, inequalities, that I was perceiving for the first time to that extent, and making me think it's really wrong to do this. It's right. And it was really getting a lot worse when I was conducting research in South Africa on breastfeeding supports at work. They told me that they were HIV positive. They had not shared this with anybody else in the family around them. Nobody knew. While we were talking about domestic violence, the father had broken her neck. And they were just looking at me, begging for help. I then realized that they had not understood, I had not clarified the research relationship. And I really walked away from this. In that situation, I didn't really quite know what to do, but I walked away from it thinking, this is so wrong. From an ethical perspective, you know, you would then actually need something to do. You need to do something that makes these women benefit as well. You can't just walk away and lose them. And yeah, my South African research partner, we did change something. In the follow-up project, we then adopted a participatory approach. I mean, that was just a pilot. So we then really made sure to include low-income women's voice in this, to also try and set up community supports and respond, to these situations. And that then made me realize, okay, there are things that we can do. There are limitations. But if we think through more carefully, there are things that we can do to support people to do the research, not all of them. Over to you.
Bianca. I thought it was great that Bianca suggested the topic of positionality, because I think it's in our lives, but I never talked about it as positionality. And I think it made sense to a lot of things that we do as researchers, but also as teachers, as practitioners. And especially when we start talking about the insider-outsider, I think I've lived for 30 years probably as an insider-outsider, because I never know exactly where I am, especially when you start living in a multicultural environment and you are from a certain country and you go to another one and you're trying to speak on behalf of that country where you came from. And then slowly you realize you don't really represent everyone anyway, right? So I think in one of my first research projects, I was speaking on behalf of Brazilians somehow. And then I realized that I represent a tiny piece of Rio and a privileged piece of Rio. So I can't speak on behalf of a lot of communities in Rio. So in a larger, maybe a project team, I can perhaps give my own impression of how things occur within the Brazilian context. But I can't speak on behalf of a lot of different experiences, which are intersections that occur to all of us. But before becoming a researcher, I was a practitioner, which is what I'm trying to touch on a little bit here. Some of you are managers in your role as academics. I was a manager before being an academic, and a lot of my experiences and how I connect with students and colleagues bring some of that to what we do. And then I started reading a lot of Paulo Freire for pedagogy, and then I realized how a lot of that makes sense to life in general. So the idea of praxis and how we put theory into practice as being something that needs, that words and actions are one. So what we do, ways of doing, ways of knowing, and ways of being are all interconnected somehow. And that positionality can be valuable for practitioners too, because you're reflecting as you do things and you're learning from your teams, you're learning from your coworkers. And I'll give you some examples of how that took place for me, especially when I was leading a larger team outside of academia that I thought was quite different from me in many ways. And then I kept looking for connections. And that's when I realized that how positionality has something about who you're dealing with and the situations that you're in, and that you're a combination of things, and that's also fluid. You keep changing, so we need to we're sort of like objects of our own research, and you observe, how am I changing? Am I questioning how I do, and the assumptions that I have as a professional, whether academic or not. So this process of stopping and thinking and questioning, how do I view myself? And then there I use my example in terms of a professional, a female, and a Latin female professional, because the salient characteristic when I worked as a manager, it was in the US, so it was a member of Latin America. So it was quite a diverse context, but it was the one thing that always seemed to be the most salient one back then, because we had a very large Latin community in the organization where I worked. But for you, it may be something else. And as a lecturer, there are other aspects that come out before being Latin. For example, some of them have to do with age or other parts of your biography or experience. Class, for example, when I was teaching in Brazil. But I'll talk about being a lecturer a little later on, but and mixing them because I've been doing both quite some time. So one thing for us to consider is what's your gaze on yourself and on others that you bring to the professional judgments that you make about your own practice, and how do you adjust your practice as you do those reflections as things are happening, right? So it's a process that's ongoing. So a couple of examples that I wanted to highlight. As a manager at AT&T, which was SBC, a large telecommunications company in the US, and very male-dominated, and headquarters in Texas. When I joined, I was a representative in every diversity meeting they had. And I remember looking at my HR file and it said, check female, check Hispanic. And I remember there was, and I was like, okay, so I'm doubly counted for the quota. And I remember having an issue with being classified as a Hispanic, because I thought, well, Brazilians are Latins, but they're not Hispanic. So I was like, okay, I'm not going to start getting involved with that. I'm just going to let it be, like, count twice in the quota. But then I started, okay, how can I then use that to my advantage? I mean, it wasn't really like strategically at that moment. I wasn't thinking, oh, I'm going to use it to get ahead, but it was more, how can I use that to relate to people? Especially when I was in marketing, I was an associate director in marketing, and back then I didn't have responsibility over a team. So it was okay to be like a Latin marketing professional. There are other people that were talking the same language in terms of marketing things that we wanted to do to telecommunications. But then suddenly I was put in a role where I had to manage 15 people who were technicians in California, handling the 50 major accounts in San Francisco. So it was like American Airlines, Bank of America. So whenever something happened, like the ATM didn't work, they called us, right? So it was a maintenance group. And I remember thinking, I didn't even know how a circuit worked. I didn't know what a T1 was or a T3, but I was marketing cell phones, mobile phones back then. So it was a very different type of job I had at first to then managing a team. But the team was very diverse, and I thought, okay, that's great. People from different countries, lots of people had accents just like me. So it wasn't something, I didn't stand out necessarily for being from somewhere else, but I did stand out as being somebody who had just finished an MBA, who didn't know anything about operations. So I had to, rather than trying to pretend that I knew something, I figured the best way is to acknowledge what I didn't know was positionality, but to be as transparent as I can. And I was like, well, I'm just not really, you are the experts in technology, so in circuits and in telecommunications, but there's things I can help you with, but you have to tell me, what can I do to make your job easier? And a lot of it was like sort of removing roadblocks so they could test circuits, and then sometimes calling another manager, calling a supervisor. But it was about creating that workplace culture that was like, okay, so I'm here to help you. I don't know about this specific thing, but there are elements of my life, of my biography, of who I am that can help us develop a relationship. And with that, I ended up working a lot with other departments, because by acknowledging what I could do or couldn't do, I could connect with a broader audience. And then I started asking people to attend customer service meetings, because I knew the director of the call center was married to a Brazilian. Then I used that connection. I was like, okay, so we started talking about Brazilian food. And then I said, can I attend a meeting there and maybe know what the problems are that customers are bringing up? And then I started also being the representative in other meetings around the company. But it's a large company, so I wasn't like everywhere, just in my own like San Francisco group. And then I realized that by presenting myself as somebody who had a certain background, but could reflect on my practice as something that I needed to adjust to that new situation, to connect with individual people who had different strengths, different stories. It was probably one of the best experiences I've ever had. And I never intended to be in operations here now. So, but it made me want to understand the relationship between people. So I think that that's when I started thinking about doing a PhD in diversity. I was like, how do these people connect? How did the supervisor-subordinate relationship work? I tend to go to people that I have more affinity with. Why does that happen? Where does the affinity come from? Is it because they are from a similar country, similar cultural background? We like similar things. So you start reflecting on that and then building on it, which is something that transfers to the classroom as well. And also removing that authority figure relationship as well, deconstructing that helps. And the other thing that happened that was really beneficial then was one of part of my background was being, having a certain political direction that I've carried through my life. So even though I was management, I was always very aware of what the union wanted, because I had been in my life in Brazil very involved with, somewhat involved, let's say, with the labor side of things. So by opening that conversation and dialogue with the union, I ended up being a lot more aware of what was happening on their side, what requests were. So informally ended up being the person that they go to sometimes, even if I didn't represent management. And I had a very good relationship with them. So I think it was really crucial to be able to be, I guess, to acknowledge who I was and to develop connections, which I think positionality, a lot of it's about that as well, not only getting to know ourselves, but also allowing people to be themselves. And then in academia, I guess using the past as a practitioner, I realized that in project teams, I usually try to bring the perspective of having been a manager before, or in a role where I had to lead people, but I also understand the realities of that side. So when I do an interview, like I did one at the NHS at the Lincoln Hospital with organizational development, and at the end, I ended up having coffee and making a friend out of somebody that I interviewed, because even when I do interviews or research, I bring myself onto the interview as well. And for a long time that worried me, because I thought, well, I need to be a lot more formal in my interviews and reveal less, but then I realized I can't do that. So I might as well look at how am I still being rigorous with my research by acknowledging who I am, but then also that interaction there is unique with that person that I'm interviewing, and then bringing all these selves into the conversation. So it brought me more peace, I guess, to look into positionality and reflect on my practice. And with students, I also, every time when I talk about theories, I try to bring in the examples as well. So I usually use there are a couple of examples that I always use. One is the Walmart cheer. I worked at Walmart too. And it was very difficult at that time to have to do the W and the A and the L with a lot of excitement. And I try to tell them, what's the positive and what's the negative? I mean, usually I tell them that I was embarrassed to do it. So I try to reveal that it's difficult for me. And then I remember that my manager complained that I didn't know the words to the Walmart cheer. I thought that was bad management, but I didn't tell her, but it was something that I took with me forever, because I was like, okay, couldn't you teach it to me then, rather than just criticizing me for not knowing the cheer? And when I hadn't grown up in a Walmart country, but I was studying there, Arkansas. I was in Arkansas for 6 years. So with students, I tell them about the Walmart cheer. I also tell them about, I worked for Procter & Gamble for a while. So Procter & Gamble hired me in the US to work in Brazil. So, and that's when the insider-outsider really comes in. They thought it was perfect. So get this person with the US education. I was crazy about Procter & Gamble because my marketing project was focused on them. I thought they had all these amazing brands. But I thought I was going to be VP of marketing someday. That was my ambition. It's gone. And then they hired me to work in Brazil. So I have the local relationships, because I was going to represent P&G in a couple of the local large chains. And then maybe that works, but the large chains, it was all about relationships. So to have the P&G projects on the shelves.
I apologize. I didn't mean to interrupt at all. I was just very curious. You mentioned briefly that one of the reasons why you moved from management into academia. And I was curious to know what other motivations led to that move from management to academia.
Okay, thank you. Christy, right?
Chris, yeah, great, thanks.
No, it was, I think I realized that I was more interested in the relationships between people than selling products, or, I mean, that's oversimplifying, but there was the speed, it was much more about the brand and trying to, especially for-profit organizations, and the processes and the rhythm was different. And I kept wanting to understand how do people relate to each other? Even if it's to get profit at the end, how do we make sure that everybody's input is considered? Why do we function better as a team this way or that way? And I think it was just the curiosity. There was no space at work to explore that. And then I realized that I wanted more to study it and to understand some of the theory behind it. And I think that the lifestyle academia really opened up a lot of options in terms of deciding what we focus on, the areas of research. So even though I started with gender at work, now I've gone into other areas with mental health, domestic violence, and leadership still, but I think it allowed me a lot more freedom. But it was more of that understanding. And also I think the ambition changed. I think at one point I remember talking to a friend that I thought I wanted to be a VP of marketing because in my company, the only female was a VP of HR. I was like, why? And I ended up, going into HR for my PhD. But I thought that there was so much that we could do. And we were in a very traditional company that was mostly men in terms of decision making. So there was also the idea of looking for change. And so in addition to understanding, maybe an avenue for change, I felt academia would provide for me. So. But I like the idea of sort of how the worlds combine. So and just to finish the PNG thing, what I realized is the thing that made the most difference at work there was the relationship with the people at the store. So even if I wanted to negotiate a huge deal, they were the ones who were going to put Ariel in a certain position that's at eye level next to Omo. Omo had been selling for 100 years. Ariel was just there. So I needed their support, but P&G didn't let us give diapers or anything away. And I thought, so I'm in between the American way of doing things that P&G had, but not generalizing the US in general, and the Brazil way of doing things, which is somebody who works there. Pampers is really expensive. My sister, was hard for her to buy. We have, our baby showers back home are like diaper showers. You give people lots of diapers. So I knew it was a problem. So I had to buy the diapers myself to then give them to people who worked at the stores because they were having some sort of like a baby shower. So to sort of like develop a relationship with them because they were the ones who most impacted my ability to sell. It wasn't like, my US education in marketing. So then, but those are things that you learn doing. But also accepting that, so I was the American at P&G Brazil. And I was like, I don't know why they're calling me that, but okay, if that works for you. But then here I'm the Brazilian. So it changes, right? Like our perspective and what's salient. So I probably took too much time on that one, but I just really
quickly, because you just said they called you the American, and I think that hits an important aspect that very often we think about our positionality very differently from other people. They might perceive us, we might think we're outsiders, they might think we're insiders. So this is why it's also so important, like in papers, to make the positionality clear, to spell it out and write it down so that people actually know what perspective you're coming from.
So, but then when it comes to lecturing, I don't know about you, but of all the parts of an academic's life, this is probably where the sleepless nights come from the most. I don't know what it's like for each one of you, but it's usually, was I fair enough with students? Did I not tell them exactly what was going to be in the exam? It's really like, especially when there's a student who tells me, oh, you didn't cover that, or sorry, I'm having a personal issue. And I'm always worried about not being fair. And I think that's where positionality and reflexivity have brought me some peace. because it's, even if we have certain tendencies, personality, background, etc., we can try to find some sort of like neutrality when it comes to empathy. Right? And we try to put in place processes to make sure they were fair as well. But the empathic neutrality, which is like constantly thinking about whether you have biases or not, and then, you know, and I guess that's in action as well in your practice, reflecting on what you're doing, how are you doing, and how your role as a teacher, who you are as a teacher, who you are as a person impacts how you teach. So we see these perspectives in pedagogic literature. So the critical pedagogy, a lot of it, you know, from Paulo Freire, lots of work on focus on class-based oppression, the teachers, the liberators, especially when we're talking about class and privilege and education as a way out. We've been talking a lot about transformative learning more recently, which focuses on the students' transformation, their self-awareness, their individuality as well, but then that they can lead to change, but it focuses on them and we're a facilitator of that change. But positionality brings in another aspect of it. And usually it comes with some sort of a self-disclosure of who you are and how you became the person, how that's fluid as well, and how they may impact your relationship with them. So the idea of positionality encourages us and the students to recognize our social positionings. So informs the lens through which we view the classroom and classroom processes as well. And you may be somebody who I usually try to bring that positionality in quite a transparent way in the beginning, and probably review a lot to students. And for a long time, I was thinking, okay, I need to do this less. But then again, I realized, well, that is how I apply theory, how I tell them how things work. And some of them respond really well, but it depends on the situation. One-on-one relationships will be different, but it helps deconstruct the authority figure that we are and maintain a relationship more equal to equal. Then the position constantly negotiated, challenged, again, the transparency and also the self-disclosure that helps without us becoming therapists, which I think that's where, you know, where do we draw the limit, which I see in one-to-one relationships sometimes. That's when I start to say, am I disclosing too much? But how does it's an important reflection is, you know, how does this positionality influence the way we teach, but then the way we are and we relate to others? So the decentering of authority, deconstructing our role and the hierarchy that exists within the classroom. And then also there are ways to engage students rationally and effectively. A lot of times we're talking about theories and we're trying to get them to think in a certain way, using rationality to build arguments and so on. And the effective element is also part of who we are. And I was having a conversation with a very senior person in our university, and I was saying, well, but I need to be less emotional. And then he said, well, but you know, emotion and rational, it's not like it's one continuum that you go from one to the other. And then I guess that's the insider outsider, because in Brazil, I'm considered a very rational person. You know, introverted, like there I'm rational and more like on the introverted side. And then I come here and it's like, oh no, I'm extroverted. And so I don't know exactly where I stand, but the context impacts that a lot. It's very relative. Okay, then academic activism, which is like our final topic, what I guess relates to the theme for today. What change can we be? We talk about impact from an academic perspective, but we want change in every levels, right? Individual, our students, society, workplace cultures, and a lot of us function already within action groups, whether it's climate, the environment, gender issues, which I guess a lot of us are involved with, but different aspects within gender or well-being, migration, and so on. A lot of us are active with issues within our profession, also through unions, association, and so on. But then in addition to doing research that informs and supports activism, there is the theorizing with intersectionalities. A lot of us who work in the work-family field are trying to get more, deal more with intersectionalities, and sometimes some of them that we may be blind to. So a lot of times we may not be counting certain groups. And then when it comes to community, I was talking to a friend the other day that I said that there was a community that was hard to reach. Then he said, well, they're not. That's your perspective that they're hard to reach. The community is there. So there's a lot of the language that we use, even in terms of giving voice. It's sometimes like, who am I to give anybody's voice? But it's, we're slowly also being aware of our own language and how that might determine our relationships. And also embedding activism in our teaching. So the critical pedagogy of developing students to transform themselves and to empower them, think about their own positionality in the world. So we can work directly with communities, also promote solidarity acts with our peers. CYGNA is here for us to support each other as well. And then in general, consideration of positionality can enhance our own ability to be an advocate.
And it starts with the individual level. When I conduct an interview, having conversations, for example, with an employee, there was this recent study on just good working conditions. And just by asking, so if the employee complained, well, we had a conversation with my employer, my manager. So did you ever seek the conversation? No, I suppose I didn't. And then they walked away. Actually, I should overcome. And then I got an email back a couple of days later saying, I did have a conversation and it's all sorted. And it's like, and just at that level and thanking me. And some also said, it was almost like a therapy session to speak to me, to have this outlet, and that they walked away reflecting. And also the employer saying, actually, that was really good because we're just always firefighting. And it just gave us the space to stop and think. And yes, we are going, it's easy to change this, that, and what have you, just by talking through it without actually, imposing any pressure. So you can achieve change at the individual level, organizational level. Like, for example, with that study, we developed this toolkit together with the organizations, and some of them are now implementing it in their organization. So there is going to be improvement in terms of working conditions in these organizations. So it can be done. And I suppose, like, over the years in my research, with whatever I do now, I always ask myself, so how can I improve practices? How can I actually make things better for the people the research is about? So, and then also, obviously, you can achieve change at policy legal framework level, local level, national level, and international level. So, and I'm been reading one of the impact case studies at the business school, and I think for me, it's like a nice outcome to see, just by preparing that, it made me realize the reach that my work has had, and it's a nice feeling. And I didn't necessarily notice it. I didn't consciously do it, but it made me realize if I did it more consciously, actually achieve so much more. And it's a wonderful feeling. Obviously, there are always limitations. There's the capacity issue as well. We're always stretched. But I think if you give these actions more thought, the way you prepare a research study, who you also get involved. I mean, I've really gone down this route. I always try to include people at policy-making level, practice-based organizations, charities, that if I don't have the capacity to change things for the better and set up a community center, or, then they do. They can actually set up initiatives that create change, but they need my help to ask the right questions.
Especially when they're doing work with communities or something like that, they are defining what the problems are too, right? And then the solution often comes from that process, the collaborative process as well, instead of the academic coming with the answers, even though we're collecting data as well, right? But so there's lots of ways that we can make an impact. I think we're almost done. And then I think there's something we mentioned before, the experience is not everything. That could limit us sometimes because we're too immersed in it. That in the absence of experience, we can build empathy relationships based on empathy in different ways. And then, you know, some other examples, but I think we've covered plenty of examples anyways. But so this is one of the key ones, right? That should not be frozen in one dimension of yourself. It's fluid, changes through time, right? And we're constantly questioning, that's the process. That, you know, research and professional encounters can vary enormously, and it's just one element, our social positionality, among the many that could shape those relationships. And
yeah, and I think that's what I actually just said, that, you know, positionality, reflexivity play an important role in this. We often do it subconsciously. If we use this more strategically, there's so much more we can do. I think it's always there, and regardless of, you know, the methods we use. And so, you know, it's really, you know, it's present in our works as lecturers, you know, as practitioners, as, you know, and also outside work. I think that's always there, but we just don't make use of it enough, I think. I just hope that we sort of finishing in a, you know, positive.
Academia can be a force for change.
Because we know,
Like we feel empowered, right?
We're dealing with capacity issues all the time. All of us do. And sometimes it can really pull us down if we, I mean, at least that's, I don't want to speak to everybody, but I suppose there are quite a few people in the room who would agree that we're so stressed and we forget about all the positive things in our jobs and the things that we can do. And yeah, let's just being aware of those more so that we can be motivated to go on.